because you're probably familiar with the idea that at least early Christians were persecuted by Rome. So what happened? How did it switch? And to do that, I feel like we should go at least and look at I misspelled it, but the internet knows who I mean. So I think of Akhenaten as an interesting person we should look at. We really could go back, of course, somewhat farther when we're doing that. Let's leave that there in case. No, I didn't want him. Get that. Let's go. Okay. Are you familiar with Abraham or Abraham? Or I've heard different. So Abraham, who was Abraham? Father Abraham. And there's the three religions that are referred to as Abrahamic, or however you want to say it, religions: Judaism, Christianity, Islam. That's in sequence, actually, although Islamists will argue that Islam is actually first, because they will argue that Muhammad, his name be praised, you're supposed to say that, is really just taking religion back to the original Abrahamic beliefs. So they would argue that actually Islam should be first. In fact, Islam should be the only one up there, basically. But in any case, who was Abraham? He was from Ur of the Chaldees. You've ever heard of that? You haven't, but I mean, apart from the town where he was from. And he had an intuition, or he was told by God, however you want to interpret it, that he should take his family and flocks and leave the city because it was so sinful. And so he does. And when he leaves, he heads out into the desert. And along come the Elohim. Oh, you know what I want to do? I'll go to Chat GPT, because I talked with Chat last night about some various things. And one of them was this. So, okay, so when scholars look back at ancient Jewish history, there's two traditions that are identified. The one is the Elohim tradition, and the other one is Yahweh, also called Jehovah. So you hear it as the E tradition or the J tradition. I've never heard it as the Y tradition. The one is from the northern kingdom and the other is from the southern kingdom. There are some differences, but of course there's overlaps. And you can see the regions are slightly different. They probably had their own temples as opposed to being in the same temple. There's the idea that the Yahwist tradition portrays God as more of an anthropomorphic, more of a human walking in the garden and so on, as opposed to the Elohim. And yet the Elohim, the one story that I especially remember, of course, is the Elohim are at number one. El is God, but Elohim is plural. So that's an interesting dilemma, because there's supposed to be three Elohim, and they come and they are hosted by Abraham, fed dinner, and basically they have such a good time that the Elohim promise Abraham that his children will inherit this land, right? And famously, his wife, Sarai, or Sarah, laughs at God. So if you look that up, she's famous for that. You know, how many women laugh at God? You know, it's kind of, you know, brilliant, you know. But the reason she's laughing is because Abraham at this point has no children. And they're promising him, you know, that his children will inherit all of this. And of course, there's no possibility of him having children because he's an old man by now, and she's postmenopausal. So it's like, you know, silly gods, you know. But Abraham takes it seriously and feels like we ought to have some children so that this promise can be fulfilled. And she says, well, I'll tell you what, here, take Hagar, my slave girl, and have a child by her. And so Abraham takes Hagar. She does become pregnant. By the way, that's a bad thing for the marriage, because once your servant girl gets pregnant and you're not, guess what? Everybody starts respecting her much more than you. And so this is a problem for Sarah. And she eventually, once Hagar has her child, and it's named Ishmael. There's the L again, right? El means God, so Ishmael, one interpretation is God hears him, right? And so she gives birth, and Sarah is upset that Hagar is so important, and she tells Abraham, get rid of them. And God says, okay, take them and leave them in this place. And so Abraham does this, takes them, leaves them in the desert with some supplies and so on. But Hagar, absolutely, you know, out of her mind with worry, runs from one hill to another in a circle around where Ishmael is lying. And by the way, that's where Mecca is. This is the location where Mecca is. And if you see the annual observance of God in Mecca, the people go around in a circle around the central temple there, and they're mimicking what Hagar was doing while she was desperate. But meanwhile, Ishmael, with his little baby feet kicking in the sand, bursts forth a well. One version. Another possibility is the angel Gabriel came down and went with his magic wand or whatever he used, and there was water, and so the seagulls notice this. This is an important event in the desert, water, fresh water. So the seagulls come. Seagulls attract the wandering Arab nomads, so the Arab nomads come and they adopt Ishmael and Hagar into the tribe. And Ishmael becomes then the ancestor of the Arabs. Meanwhile, Sarai has a miracle. She becomes pregnant, despite the fact that she's past the point where she could. And she gives birth to Isaac. By the way, in some stories, Isaac and Ishmael actually know one another, so they're not completely separate somehow. You know these stories, they get lots of versions and so on. But meanwhile, Isaac, of course, ends up having children, and it's the tribes of Israel. So the Jewish tradition highly respects Isaac as their ancestor, and the Arabs highly respect Ishmael. And by the way, the story, who gets the land goes to the son who has the birthright. And Abraham is told by God to take his only son up the mountain and sacrifice him. And that's like, whoa, that's ridiculous. But, all right, so he takes his only son up the hill, has the knife, he has the rope, he has the wood for the fire. The son notices, we're missing the animal. But of course, once they get up there, Abraham ties up his son and gets ready to sacrifice his son when the hand of Gabriel stops him, and he notices that there's a ram stuck there, and it's clearly a sign that he's not to sacrifice his son. And so they sacrifice the ram and then come back down etc. Now here's the interesting thing, of course, and why people still argue over whose land that is. On the one hand, the Arabs argue that it must have been Ishmael, because he was the only son for a time, right? So if it's the only son, it would have to be Ishmael. On the other hand, the Jewish tradition says, well, no, the only official son, the only legitimate son was the one had by Sarai, and so therefore it's Isaac. So the land is ours. Think of stories that have caused problems over the centuries, because that's still a big issue if you think about it. But if we go on to this, notice, and I would like to argue that a question comes up, who was the first monotheist? And you might want to say, well, Abraham. I would argue that that's incorrect, because Abraham recognizes that there are other gods. Besides El, you have Baal, which is the god of the Babylonians, for example. Now, El we hear in Israel, right, which is the temple of the Most High God, in one interpretation, right? Lots of interpretations of all these words, of course. But you hear that El in lots of names, for example, Rachel, Gabriel, Michael, etc. They all mean, things in Hebrew. But if you know the story, Hebrew is also the Egyptian word for slave. And the Hebrews famously ended up becoming slaves in Egypt. And that's where I want to go to Akhenaten. And by the way, I asked, who was the first monotheist? Many will argue that Akhenaten apparently is, as far as we know, the first monotheist. But I remember one year a student said to me, well, Adam is the first monotheist. And I was stuck. Because, well, yeah, if you follow that story, Adam and then Eve are in the garden, and they're, in communication with the voice in the garden. So that certainly looks like a monotheist. The trouble is, if you buy into the evolutionary model, the theory that says, well, before Homo sapiens, you had other hominids, for example. What then would you have meant by Adam? Was there a belly button? Sorry, that's just one of my favorites. But you get into let's look at a historical model or a sociological or anthropological model and think about it that way. And strictly speaking, Abraham was in a contract or a testament with one particular God who he had a special agreement with. That's how I think most people read the Abrahamic stories. But there were other gods. So we wouldn't, strictly speaking, refer to him as a monotheist, although he was connected, to one particular god. But Akhenaten, who is an Egyptian pharaoh, and I love kind of go to YouTube, one of my YouTube channels. I hope it's the right one, and I can say search here, and I want actually I should have gone to let's go. So if you ever get a chance to visit Philadelphia and go, I'll show you this real quick. This is
Bridget, you are
a commercial.
With two wonderful children, embrace the chaos.
Embrace the chaos. Okay. So this is the Code of Hammurabi, if you're familiar with that. Ever heard of that? 450 rules. It's not the actual stela, it's a copy. I don't know how they made those, but it's the same size and everything. and it's there in the lobby of the museum when you go into the University of Pennsylvania Museum of Art and Archaeology, which is right across from Franklin Field. So, I even played in the band for a Eagles football game at Franklin Field years ago. Wow, that was kind of fun.
You said that's not the real one. Does the real one still exist?
Yes, I suspect you can look and find where it is. I guess it's in maybe the British Museum. They stole everything they could. So, that's one way of doing that. Steal it and then you have it in your museum. You're protecting it. You don't want.
In Paris.
It's in Paris. In the Louvre?
Yep.
That bust of, he's in there too.
The bust of who? Akhenaten? Yeah, you can say it the way you said it. There he is. I don't know if you saw that. Let me notice the hands. Can you see it? A little washed out on the screen. You do. That's why sometimes when I come in, I usually just turn on the one light so that you can see, not sit on somebody else's lap. But at the same time, you can see that Akhenaten was weird in lots of ways. And this is too much fun. I was thinking, should I show you this or not? But let's see if I manage to get to it. Okay.
Nick Bagish supports RFK Jr. to serve in Donald Trump's cabinet. In their plan, cut taxes.
This is eventually going to make this not feasible to use YouTube if they keep giving you more and more crap that you have to watch.
Yeah, it's all
A
those
vacation
political
before we
aspects
can
of
do
that
like
video I
this
did
so much
back
more
in
because
November.
there's more included. Right?
Okay. So, I talked about music earlier and whether or not you might like the right kind of music or not. This is awful. Please put up with it for a moment. It's actually very popular, although I don't know why. But it's an opera. There's a series of these done by Glass, Glass, isn't it? As I recall. But notice that the role of Akhenaten in the opera is sung by a male soprano. That's how they are made. It's very different, I think, today than it used to be. They used to. Let's not talk. In any case, I don't know how he got to be a male soprano, but he's singing the role of Akhenaten, and this particular prayer in Egyptian is written and recorded as a prayer of Akhenaten. And notice that you can see that the stage set, this is at the Met, by the way, in New York, and notice they use the hand gesture. So there are prayers from Akhenaten, by the way, that are still incorporated in many doxologies. For example, God of God, light of light, true God of true God. If you're familiar with that expression, that's right out of Akhenaten. In any case, as Pharaoh, his job was to travel from sacred place to sacred place in order to time it with the sun showing up where that particular temple was arranged for the sun on that day. So he had to time it precisely so that everybody was impressed because the sun would come up exactly where it's supposed to, thanks to his arrival. Which it was a tiring process, I guess. And so he eventually decided that instead of worshiping all of these various gods in Egypt, he would instead erase all the other ones and just worship one god, the sun god, the Aten. And so he's considered by many to be the first monotheist. Didn't last very long. He either died or was killed by the priesthood because it screwed up the economy terribly. You can imagine, I don't want to bring it up to date to reference, what silly autocrats do that get everybody upset because they change the rules and wipe out, everybody's job, basically. But if you do that, people don't like you. And in any case, he ended up dying. And his son, Tutankhamun, or Tutankhaten, but they changed their name to fit the god that they're, concerned with. So Tutankhamun was his son, and everyone knows that him as King Tut. You might have even gotten to see I saw the exhibit in San Francisco when it came around. If you get to see the funeral gold and all that stuff, etc. But so, oh shoot.
Steve Martin,
Did Steve Martin do that one? He did King Tut. He did the dance. Yes, King Tut. Yeah, silly. Sorry about that. No, I didn't think of using that one. But the fun thing is Freud. And when we get to Freud, let's not do the Freudian